So this is a two-part lesson, the first part being the characteristics of life and what constitutes a living thing, and the second part being the cell theory. So if we take a look at the characteristics of life, what does it mean to be alive? What is the difference between something that is living and is not? So let's define those characteristics. The first characteristic that all living things have is that they possess growth, or they go through the process of growth and development. So they undergo changes in shape or size or a maturation process. So for example, if we're thinking about plants, they go from a seed, they develop roots, they develop stems. If we're talking about people, right, if you look at a baby versus a toddler versus a teenager versus an adult, there's clearly changes in shape and size and a maturation occurring. The second characteristic of living things is the acquisition of energy. So its ability to obtain energy to do something, do the activities that they need to stay alive. So whether it's growth or movement or repair. Now that energy quite often we think of as eating. That's a narrow-minded view of it, because for people, we like to think just of people, but plants don't eat, as we say. They acquire energy from sunlight and they create their own food. So obtaining and using energy, if we look at a plant, would be photosynthesizing. They're actually creating their own sugar that they can then use to create ATP energy. In terms of humans, it's actually ingestion and digestion of our food. Now that also includes the acquisition of nutrients and gas exchanges. So as human beings, we breathe in oxygen and use that to get the energy from our foods and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants do that as well, but they also, in the process of photosynthesis, require taking in carbon dioxide, and they actually let out oxygen. Third characteristic of living things is reproduction. In order to be considered alive, they have to be able to give rise to offspring. So that could be sexually or asexually. There must be a perpetuation of species. So in terms of sexual reproduction, humans are perfect examples. There are genetic variations from one generation to the next. Whereas in asexual reproduction, there is no combining or recombination of genetic material. The daughter cells are identical to the parent cells. So that would be something like bacteria. Fourth characteristic of living things that we're going to take a look at is responsiveness, ability to adapt or to respond to the environment at a given time. So responsiveness is something that happens quickly. It's not a long-term thing. So if you're looking at plants, if you've ever seen sunflowers, videos, they follow the sun. Or if you ever turn a plant in your house, their leaves will then grow towards the sun. They're responding to their environment. In terms of human beings, right, you step on something sharp, you pull up your foot quickly, or you touch something hot, you pull your hand back quickly. You are responding to your environment. Fifth characteristic of living things is homeostasis. So all living things need to be able to maintain a constant internal environment that is different from their external environment. So there can be changes such as temperature or pH in their external environment, but they have the ability to maintain homeostasis, or a constant internal environment within either their cell or their entire living organism. And that is maintained through excretion. So as humans, we urinate to get rid of some of the waste products that we produce to maintain homeostasis. Body temperature, humans, we sweat, we perspire to decrease our body temperature, we shiver to increase our body temperature. In terms of pH, we have our kidneys that are doing some buffering and things like that, but we have lots of different ways as human beings that we maintain homeostasis. Plants have a lot of different ways as well. They have specific cells on their leaves that open and close to allow gases in at different times. They'll close in order to keep water in so they don't dehydrate. But in order to be alive, they have to be able to maintain homeostatic values or homeostasis. The sixth characteristic of living things is order and organization. The first and most important part of this characteristic is they must be composed of cells. So everything that's alive is composed of cells. It can be one cell, could be a unicellular organism, or it could be multiple cells. It could be millions or billions of cells, such as human beings. They are organized and structured in different levels of organization. So in terms of humans, we start off with cells. Like cells create tissues, tissues create organs, organs create organ systems, and then organ systems working together create an entire organism. So depending on the complexity of that living thing, there will be different levels of organization. Some are simply at the single cell level. Some are very complex and have entire organ systems. The seventh and last characteristic of living things is adaptation. Now, this is often confused with responsiveness. Adaptation, keep in mind, is what happens over a long period of time. That's the key difference here. So its ability to actually change structure and appearance over time based on changes in the environment. So in terms of butterflies, they have developed designs on their wings that help them mimic their environments and blend in so they're not seen by predators. Bird beaks have changed over time to allow them to better access the food that's available in a certain area. So adaptation takes a long time. Responsiveness that we talked about earlier is a very quick change in response to the environment. Okay, so when we talk about the characteristics of living things, if something is living, it must have all 7 characteristics. 6 is not going to cut it. It has to have 7. It's all or nothing. Okay, so living things might have a few of the characteristics, but if it does not have all 7, it is not alive. One of the kind of hotly debated topics in this is viruses. Viruses have a lot of the living things. However, one of the big ones that they cannot do independently is reproduce. They need a host in order to do that, and that is why currently under scientific definitions, viruses are not considered alive. Right? In terms of defining things, dead means it was once living. So something that's dead had to at one point in time meet all 7 characteristics of living things. Okay? So let's put that into action. If we're taking a look at a volcano, is a volcano alive? So take a second, pause the video, look at those 7 characteristics of life that we have listed here. Which does a volcano actually, is it capable of doing? And which is it not capable of doing? Okay, so if we come back to our volcano example, and we want to look at each of those 7 characteristics. Now, do volcanoes grow and develop? Technically, they do change shape and size. Geologists might argue that they do grow and develop. So we could say that yes, they do actually have that characteristic. Acquisition of energy. They don't eat per se, as a human would, but not all living things do. Is there any way that they're getting energy? And yes, they're actually getting and absorbing thermal energy from the core of the Earth. So we can say that they do have an acquisition of energy. Now, if we look at reproduction, is there a perpetuation of species? Can they make baby volcanoes? No. So right there, we know the volcanoes are not alive because they are missing one of the 7 characteristics. However, let's continue to look at the rest. Do they respond to their environment? Yeah, they can actually respond to their environment. And depending on what rocks are in the way, the lava might flow a different way. So you could consider that responding. Do they maintain homeostasis or an internal environment that is different from the outside? Well, external environmental changes will directly affect the internal. They don't have any way of being separate or segregated or maintaining something that's different. So no, they don't actually maintain homeostasis. In terms of organization, so the first thing there is, are they made of cells? No. If we took a microscope and we looked at lava or we looked at a part of a volcano, they are not made of cells. So there's another characteristic it does not possess. Adaptation, do they change over the long term and over time in order to be better suited to their environment? No. Okay, so clearly we can see volcanoes are not alive. So let's move on to the cell theory. Since one of the characteristics of being alive is order and organization, it means that they must be made of cells. It's important that we also look at what is the cell theory. So the cell theory has 3 major components. The first is that all living things are made up of cells. Okay, so if something's alive, it has to have cells. It could be one, it could be many. So if we look at this leaf here, you can see that there are cells within that leaf. The second part is that the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. So a cell on its own is almost like an independent little living thing. They maintain their own functions of life. They actually have to get their own energy. They have to get rid of their own waste. So essentially, each cell is doing all those characteristics of life, even though they might be part of a larger organism. And the third and final component of the cell theory is that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg. A cell just can't spontaneously be there. It had to come from something else. And a common misconception about this is, when you have, say, mold on cheese that's been in your fridge for too long, or you have bacteria, that came from a cell that was already there. It didn't just magically appear. Okay, so all cells arrive from pre-existing cells. This is the original cell theory. There have been some updates, as in the modern cell theory, for additional statements. You will not be required to know this for this course, but sometimes it's nice to know that there have been some changes to it. So the first one, all cells have some sort of hereditary information, whether that's DNA, whether that's RNA, and that hereditary information is passed on cell to cell to cell, whether it's through sexual or asexual reproduction. All cells basically the same in terms of chemical composition. It might be various amounts or percentages of different things, but pretty much all cells function the same way and are made up of the same components. All basic chemical and physiological functions are carried out inside the cell. So everything the cell needs to do is inside that cell. They don't kind of do something outside and then bring it inside. Everything they do is all contained within that cell membrane inside that cell. And lastly, cell activity depends on the cell activities of subcellular structures. So even though the cell is the basic unit of living things, there are smaller components that are all required for that cell to function. So different organelles like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, things like that, that all have a function to play in order to keep that cell alive.